You know that feeling at the end of a long, long day? Not just a busy day, but one of those emotionally draining ones where every hour feels like it's scraping a little piece of you away. That was my Tuesday, 12 hours staring at a spreadsheet, fueled by stale coffee and the hum of a dying fluorescent light above my cubicle. By the time I finally logged off, my brain felt like static and my eyes were burning. And of course, it was raining. Not a gentle, romantic movie kind of rain. This was a cold, spiteful Chicago rain in late October, the kind that feels like needles on your skin and finds its way down the back of your collar no matter how you angle your umbrella. The streets were a mess of shimmering black asphalt and blurs of red taillights. All I wanted was my bed. Just the thought of my pillow was like a prayer. The fastest way home was the L train. On a normal day, I dreaded it, the crowds, the smells, the sheer noise of it all. But tonight, the idea of being packed in with 100 other damp, grumpy people was somehow worse than the rain itself. I just needed to get home. I pulled my jacket tighter and made my way down the slick, echoing steps of the Monroe station. The platform was quiet. That was the first thing that felt off, but in a good way. It was almost 11 p.m., so a smaller crowd was expected, but this was different. It was deserted. There was a guy in a hoodie way down at the far end, and maybe 2 other people scattered about, but the usual late-night crew of students and bar staff just wasn't there. The air was heavy with the smell of wet concrete and that weird, metallic tang that all subways have. For a moment, I felt a wave of relief. No pushing, no shouting, no one playing music from their phone speaker. Just peace. Looking back, I guess that's how it always starts, isn't it? With a feeling of relief. A small, lucky break that makes you lower your guard. The train came rumbling out of the dark tunnel, its single bright eye cutting through the gloom. The sound echoed off the tiled walls, a familiar, comforting roar. It screeched to a halt, and the doors slid open with a pneumatic hiss. I stepped inside, shaking the rain from my coat. The car was just as empty as the platform. Maybe 6 or 7 people in a car built to hold 100. They were all sitting alone, separated by rows of empty seats. A woman with a large tote bag, a young guy with massive headphones over his ears, an older man in a worn-out blazer. Everyone was doing their own thing, staring at their phones or just gazing blankly at the floor. Classic end-of-day city behavior. I didn't think anything of it. In fact, I was grateful. I slid into one of the cool, hard plastic seats, shoved my earbuds in, and leaned my head against the vibrating window. The doors slid shut, sealing me inside, and the train lurched forward, plunging back into the darkness. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the track, the gentle swaying of the car, it was almost hypnotic. My eyelids felt like they were weighted down with lead. I closed them, letting the muffled sounds of my podcast wash over me. For the first time all day, the tension in my shoulders started to ease. This was okay. 30 more minutes, and I'd be home. I could do 30 more minutes. I must have drifted off for a bit, or maybe I just zoned out completely. When I opened my eyes, the blackness of the tunnel had been replaced by the fleeting, strobing lights of the Jackson station passing by. We weren't stopping. An express, I guess. That was fine by me. Faster home. My gaze drifted across the car, idly scanning the other passengers. Just out of boredom, you know? And that's when I saw him. The man in the worn-out blazer, sitting near the doors at the far end of the car. He was just looking straight ahead, his hands resting on his knees. And there was something about his face. It wasn't that he was handsome or ugly or had a scar or anything distinctive at all. That was the problem. His face was the most aggressively average face I had ever seen. Brown hair, plain features, a kind of bland, placid expression. But as I looked at him, a weird sense of déjà vu washed over me. I felt like I knew him. Not just that he looked familiar, but that I knew him, personally. I racked my brain, my tired mind sifting through a Rolodex of faces from old jobs, college, apartments I'd lived in. Was he a client? A temp from a few years ago? The guy who works at the dry cleaners? Nothing clicked, but the feeling was so strong, so insistent. It was a strange, prickly sensation, like having a word on the tip of your tongue. He didn't look at me, he just kept staring forward into the middle distance. His complete stillness was a little odd. Most people fidget, they check their phones, they scratch their nose, they look around. He was like a statue. I shook my head, rubbing my temples. And, you're exhausted, you're overtired and your brain is starting to short circuit. It's called face blindness or something, right? You're just projecting familiarity onto a stranger because you're half asleep. It was the only logical explanation. I forced myself to look away, pulling out my own phone and pretending to scroll through social media. The blue light felt harsh, but it was a good distraction. Look at puppies, I told myself. Look at memes. Don't look at the weirdly familiar, unnervingly still man at the end of the train car. For a few minutes, it worked. The train rattled on, the mundane world of my phone screen a welcome anchor to reality. I could feel the train slowing for the next stop, Harrison. The automated voice, calm and digitized, announced the station name. But the train didn't stop. It just coasted through, the platform lights flashing past the windows like a badly edited film. Odd, 2 express tracks in a row? I couldn't remember that ever happening on the Red Line late at night. A flicker of annoyance went through me, but it was quickly swamped by my exhaustion. Whatever, I'd get off at the next one. I put my phone down and chanced another look around the car, trying to be casual about it. The man in the blazer hadn't moved a muscle. Not one. I let my eyes wander over to the woman with the large tote bag. She was sitting a few rows ahead of me, on the opposite side. She had a paperback book open in her lap, her head angled down towards it. I watched her for a second, my eyes tracing the line of her jaw, her nose, the way her hair fell. And then my blood went cold. It wasn't a sudden shock. It was a slow, creeping horror that started in the pit of my stomach and spread outwards like ice. At first, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. It just didn't compute. It was impossible. So I stared, trying to find the flaw in my perception, trying to find the detail that would prove my exhausted eyes were playing tricks on me. But there was no flaw. The woman reading the book had the exact same face as the man in the blazer. The same aggressively average brown hair, the same bland, forgettable features, the same nose, the same mouth, set in the same neutral, placid line. It was him, but with longer hair and wearing a woman's coat. No, that wasn't right. It wasn't a man in a wig. The features were softer, but identical. It was as if someone had taken a default character from a video game and just clicked the female option. A face without history, without personality. A blank slate, and she was just as still as he was, her eyes fixed on the pages of her book, unmoving. My breath caught in my throat, a tiny, hitching sound in the relative quiet of the rattling car. This wasn't possible. This was a nightmare. I was having some kind of waking dream, brought on by stress and lack of sleep. That had to be it. That was the only thing that made any sense at all. My first thought, clear as a bell in the screaming chaos of my own head, was, it's a prank. It had to be. Some late-night TV show, a hidden camera thing. Or maybe a flash mob, one of those weird, artsy ones. It was Chicago, after all. People did strange things here all the time. It was the only explanation that my brain could grab onto, the only piece of driftwood in an ocean of impossible. I clung to it. So, okay, a prank. Those two must be in on it. Twins, maybe? Incredibly similar-looking siblings wearing prosthetics? It was elaborate for sure, but still within the realm of possibility. I took a slow breath, my lungs feeling tight and small. I told myself to calm down. All I had to do was play along, not react. The worst thing you can do in a hidden camera show is be the person who freaks out. I would not be that person. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, on a grimy spot where someone had spilled a soda long ago. The rhythmic clack-clack, clack-clack of the wheels was the only thing that felt real. I tried to focus on it, to use it as an anchor. Just a normal train ride. A weird prank is happening, but it's still just a train ride. I'll be home in 20 minutes. But the silence from the other passengers was starting to feel heavy. It wasn't a normal city dweller silence, the kind born from mutual exhaustion and a desire to be left alone. This was a charged, deliberate silence, the kind of quiet you feel in a room right before a predator strikes. The air itself felt thick in my lungs, humming with a frequency I couldn't quite hear but could feel in my teeth. Against my better judgment, my eyes started to wander again. I couldn't help it. My terror was eclipsed by a morbid, desperate need to confirm, or hopefully disprove, what I was seeing. I needed more data. My gaze slid sideways, trying to be casual, towards the young guy a few seats up. He was the one with the huge, expensive-looking headphones on, the ones that cover your whole ear. He was wearing a dark hoodie and staring out the window into the blackness of the tunnel. I told myself his face would be different. Of course it would be. He was young, probably a college kid. He'd have acne or a 5 o'clock shadow or a piercing. Something, anything. Slowly, as if he sensed my look, his head turned from the window towards the center of the car. Not looking at me, just looking forward. The dim, flickering light caught his features, and my stomach dropped. The prank theory dissolved. The driftwood I was clinging to turned to dust and slipped through my fingers. There was no art project, no TV show, that could explain this. It was the same face. The exact same aggressively blank, placidly normal face. On a younger-looking head, with a different haircut, but it was the face. No acne, no stubble, just a smooth, eerily neutral canvas. The headphones seemed absurd on him, a prop from a different reality. What could he possibly be listening to? What kind of music would a person with a face like that listen to? The thought was so bizarre it almost made me want to laugh, a hysterical, bubbling sound that I had to physically swallow back down. Panic was no longer a flicker. It was a forest fire, roaring up my spine, making the tiny hairs on my arms and the back of my neck stand on end. My breathing hitched. I felt cold, so incredibly cold, even though the car was stuffy. I had to look at the others. I had to know. There was an old woman, 2 rows behind the book reader. She was slumped against the window, her head covered in a silk scarf, her body bundled in a thick wool coat. She looked like she was asleep. A sweet old grandma, dozing on her way home. My mind screamed at me not to look, to just leave it, to pretend she was just a sleeping old woman. But I couldn't. I leaned forward just slightly, as if I were stretching a kink out of my back, and angled my head to see her face in the reflection of the dark window opposite her. The reflection was distorted, warped by the grime and the vibration of the glass, but it was clear enough. Beneath the silk scarf, the face was smooth, the lines around the eyes and mouth not the deep-set wrinkles of old age, but faint, shallow impressions, as if they were drawn on. It was the face, the same mouth, the same nose, the same empty space where a personality should be. Her stillness wasn't a piece of sleep, it was the stillness of an object. A doll, that was it. I was going to be sick. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking so badly it took me 2 tries to get it out of my coat pocket. The casing felt slippery with my own sweat. I jabbed the home button, and the screen flared to life, a blindingly bright rectangle of false hope. My thumb swiped randomly across the apps, opening my email, then my weather app, then a folder of games I never played. It didn't matter. I wasn't seeing any of it. The screen was just a shield. A flimsy, pathetic shield to hide behind. Don't look up. Just don't look up. They don't know you've noticed. If you just pretend to be on your phone like a normal person, they'll leave you alone. They're just there, whatever they are. Just be normal. My heart was a wild animal trapped in my ribcage, slamming against the bone. I could hear the blood roaring in my ears, a sound so loud it almost drowned out the clatter of the train. I tried to take a deep, steadying breath, but it came out as a ragged gasp. My fingers were trembling, my thumb hovering uselessly over the screen. I tried to type a text message to my roommate, just to feel like I was doing something real, something connected to the world outside this car. Help me, I typed. My thumb shook so much the letters came out as a jumble. HRLP Mr. Who was I kidding? I couldn't send that. She'd think I was drunk. What could she even do? Call the police? Hello, officer? My roommate is on a train with a bunch of people who have the same face. They'd hang up on her. I was completely and utterly alone in this. The train wasn't slowing down. We should have been at Roosevelt by now. Then Cermak Chinatown, but we just kept flying through the dark, the occasional flash of a station platform whipping by the windows like a fading memory. We were going faster, I realized. The rhythmic clack-clack was becoming a frantic, high-pitched drumming. I had to look. I had to know if they were still just sitting there. The not knowing was somehow worse than the knowing. I took a shaky breath. I started counting in my head, a stupid little trick my mom taught me to do when I was scared as a kid. 1. My eyes were glued to the glowing screen of my phone. The light felt hot on my face. 2. I could feel their presence, a collective weight in the air. 3. My throat was bone dry. I tried to swallow but there was nothing there. 4. Just a quick glance, a tiny flick of the eyes. That's all. 5. They're not looking at you. They're just staring into space. They're not interested in you. 6. My knuckles were white where I gripped my phone. 7. The train screamed around a long curve, the force pushing me hard against the side of my seat. 8. Okay, now, do it. 9. I lifted my head. It wasn't a slow, creeping turn. It was a single, silent, perfectly synchronized movement, like a flock of birds changing direction in midair, or a school of fish turning as one. Every single one of them, the man in the blazer, the woman with the book, the kid with the headphones, the old woman in the scarf, and 2 others I hadn't even dared to look at before, had turned their heads. And they were all staring directly at me. There was no emotion in their gaze. No anger, no curiosity, no malice. Nothing. It was the blank, indifferent stare of a security camera. A dozen unblinking eyes, all identical, all set in the same, impossible face, all focused on me. The silence in the car was absolute, the roar of the train fading into a distant hum. Everything in the universe had collapsed into this one, single moment. Their faces and my fear. They knew I had seen them. And now, they were seeing me. The universe snapped down to a single point of audio input, the frantic, useless thunder of my own heart. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't think, there was only the sight of them. A dozen pairs of identical, vacant eyes, fixed on me. They weren't angry, they weren't threatening, not in any active way. It was worse than that. It was the absolute, profound disinterest you might see in the glass eyes of a taxidermied animal. I wasn't a person to them. I was an object that had suddenly moved, an anomaly in their silent, static world. Time stretched and became sticky, like taffy. I don't know how long we stayed like that, me frozen in my seat, phone still clutched in my white-knuckled hand, and them, a silent chorus of the same face, just watching. The constant, rhythmic clatter of the train on the tracks was the only thing that proved the world hadn't stopped entirely. It was a metronome counting down to something I couldn't begin to imagine. My mind, in a desperate search for an escape hatch, tried to find a leader among them. There wasn't one. They were a collective, a single entity wearing different sets of clothes. The man in the blazer, the woman with the paperback, the kid in the hoodie. They weren't individuals. They were limbs of the same creature. My brain was screaming at me to do something. Run, scream, fight, but my body was locked down, paralyzed by a disbelief so profound it felt like a physical weight. You see things like this in movies, in nightmares. You don't see them on the Red Line at 11:30 on a Tuesday night. The sheer impossibility of it all was its greatest defense. Part of me was still whispering, this isn't real. You're having a panic attack. You fell asleep and this is a dream. And then, a voice cut through the suffocating silence. Next stop is, Cermak Chinatown. Doors open on the right at Cermak Chinatown. The voice was tinny, robotic, and utterly, beautifully normal. It was the automated announcement I'd heard 1,000 times before, a sound so mundane that I usually tuned it out completely. But in that moment, it was the voice of an angel. It was a lifeline thrown from the real world into my personal hell. It was proof that this was still a train, that it was still connected to the city, to streets and buildings and other people. It wasn't some phantom vessel sailing through an alternate dimension. It was just a train, and it was about to stop at my station. A jolt of pure, chemical adrenaline shot through me, overriding the paralysis. Hope. It was a staggering, intoxicating feeling. I had an out. All I had to do was get off the train. I didn't dare look at them. I knew if I made eye contact again, I'd freeze. My plan was simple, born of pure animal instinct. Stand up, walk to the doors on the right, and the second they hiss open, I bolt. I run and I don't look back. My muscles screamed in protest as I forced myself to move. I felt like I was wading through deep water. I pushed myself up from the sticky plastic seat, my legs trembling so violently I was afraid they'd give out. I kept my eyes locked on the scuffed, gray floor, then lifted them to focus on the double doors a few yards away. The yellow warning sticker on the glass felt like a holy symbol. Do not lean on doors. I wanted to run and press my entire body against them. I took one step, then another. My movements felt clumsy, loud. My coat rustled, my sneakers squeaked on the floor. In the crushing silence of the car, every tiny sound I made was an explosion. And then, a new sound joined mine. It wasn't loud, it was a soft, unified sigh of shifting fabric. A quiet, single rustle, as if one large person had stood up, but it came from all around me. A collective stirring. My willpower finally cracked. I had to look. I let my eyes flick sideways, just a millimeter. And the hope that had surged through me just moments before curdled into pure, ice-cold dread. They were all standing, every single one of them, in perfect, silent synchronicity. They hadn't moved towards me. They hadn't made any aggressive posture. They just stood, like statues that had been suddenly activated. The man in the blazer. The woman with the book, which she now held closed at her side. The young guy, headphones still over his ears. The old woman, no longer slumped, but standing arrow straight. They formed a loose, informal perimeter. They weren't overtly blocking the doors, not in a way you could prove. But their presence, their sudden shared movement, had changed the very architecture of the space. The train car was no longer a public space. It was a cage, and they were the bars. My breath hitched in my throat. I turned my back on them, a monumental act of denial, and stared desperately out the window. The dark tunnel was giving way to the familiar, sickly yellow glow of a station. I could see the concrete pillars flashing by, faster and faster. There it was, the red and white sign. Cermak Chinatown, tile walls covered in years of city grime. A bench where a man in a maintenance uniform was taking a break, drinking from a thermos. A real person. Oh, God, a real, normal person. Tears of relief pricked my eyes. He was maybe 50 feet away. In 10 seconds, I could be standing on that platform with him. The train, however, wasn't slowing down. At first, I told myself I was just panicking. That my perception of time and speed was warped by terror. Trains always feel like they're going too fast right before they brake hard. It's normal, it's going to stop. But the rhythmic roar of the wheels didn't change its pitch. The clack 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 that had been my countdown to freedom didn't decelerate into the drawn-out groan of brakes. It remained a frantic, steady drumbeat. The maintenance worker on the bench looked up, his expression turning from boredom to mild confusion as he watched us approach. We weren't slowing down, we were speeding up. No, I whispered, the word a tiny, useless puff of air against the cold glass. No, stop. The platform, my sanctuary, my entire world of hope, flew at the window. I saw it all in a horrifying, crystal-clear flash frame. The pattern of the tiles. A discarded newspaper, the man with the thermos pushing himself off the bench, his mouth now agape. It was a perfect, detailed diorama of a world I was no longer a part of. And then it was gone. With a deafening roar and a violent lurch, the train shot through the station. The platform vanished behind us in a smear of yellow light, swallowed instantly by the ravenous darkness of the tunnel ahead. My mind just broke. The last thread of rationality snapped. I slammed my palms against the thick glass of the door, as if I could somehow push my way out into the empty space we'd just left behind. Stop! The scream was trapped in my throat, emerging as a strangled, pathetic croak. Let me out! I risked a glance over my shoulder. They were all still standing. Still watching me, and now I could see it. In the dead center of one of those identical, impossible fact, the one on the man in the blazer, the corners of the mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile, it was a muscular spasm, a tiny, horrifying flicker of movement in the mask. It was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen in my life. I turned back to the window, pressing my forehead against the cool, vibrating glass. The darkness outside was absolute. The comforting lights of the station were gone. There were no more signs, no more pillars, no more people. There was only the endless black of the tunnel and the reflections of the figures standing silently behind me. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels was no longer the sound of a commute. It was the sound of my own abduction. I was locked in, I was trapped, and we were going somewhere else. I stayed glued to the window, my forehead pressed so hard against the vibrating glass that I think it left a mark. The darkness outside was total. Not just the regular dark of a tunnel between stations, but a thick, swallowing kind of blackness that felt like a substance. The only light came from the sickly yellow emergency bulbs inside the car, and all they did was turn the windows into perfect, cruel mirrors. Every time I tried to search the void outside for a sign, for anything, all I saw was the reflection of the car behind me. The reflection of them, standing, silent, watching my back. I don't know how long we were in that tunnel. Minutes? An hour? Time just stopped making sense. The steady, rhythmic clack 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 of the wheels was the only thing I had to hold on to, the one piece of a normal world that hadn't been ripped away. It was a metronome, but I didn't know what it was counting down to anymore. My heart hammered against my ribs, trying to keep up with the train's frantic pace. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was an express track. Maybe there was a system failure, and the driver was just trying to get to the next major hub. I repeated these things to myself, whispered them into the cold glass, but they were like trying to build a sandcastle against a tidal wave. The lie was too thin, and the truth was too big. The truth was standing right behind me. Then the sound changed. It wasn't a slow, graceful deceleration you feel when you're pulling into a station. There was no gentle sigh of the air brakes. This was a wrenching, metal-on-metal scream, a horrible grinding noise that vibrated up from the floor, through the soles of my shoes, and into my teeth. It felt like the world's biggest fingernails being dragged across the world's biggest chalkboard. The whole car shuddered violently, throwing me sideways against the window frame. I yelped, a pathetic, strangled sound, and instinctively threw my arms out to catch myself. And just like that, the noise stopped. The motion stopped. The silence that followed was so total, so absolute, it was louder than the noise had been. The roaring, the clattering, the screaming of the brakes, it was all gone. Replaced by nothing. I could hear the buzz of the emergency lights overhead. I could hear the frantic, wet sound of my own breathing. I could feel my pulse throbbing in my ears, a weak, fleshy drum against the deafening quiet. We were stopped, somewhere deep in the guts of the city, in a place we weren't supposed to be. I held my breath, straining to hear anything. A voice over an intercom, the sound of another train, footsteps, anything, but there was only the oppressive silence of the tomb we were in. Slowly, carefully, I peeled my face from the window and forced myself to turn. They were still there, exactly where they had been. Standing, motionless, an array of mannequins in a forgotten warehouse. The lack of movement was more terrifying than any attack could have been. It was patient. It was confident. They knew there was nowhere for me to go. They were arranged in the car in a way that felt deliberate, a loose formation that cut off every easy path to either end of the car. My back was already against the doors on one side. The only other way out was through them. My mind was a slideshow of impossible options. Scream? Who would hear? Fight? With what? My laptop bag? They didn't even look like they could be fought. They looked like they would just absorb the blows, their blank faces never changing. I was a rat in a very clean, very quiet, very well-lit cage. And then, a sound. A hiss. It cut through the silence like a razor blade. The clean, sharp sound of pneumatics. A sound I'd heard 1,000 times before. Doors are opening. A perfectly normal train sound. But this time, it came from the wrong side. It came from the doors directly across from me. Not the doors I was leaning against, the doors that would, in a sane world, open onto a platform. It was the other set. The ones that faced the opposite track, the ones that faced the chasm of the tunnel. My blood went cold. I watched, frozen, as the rubber seams on those double doors parted. They slid open with a smooth, whisper-quiet efficiency. They opened onto nothing, onto the solid, physical block of blackness that I'd been staring at just moments before. It wasn't just dark out there. It was a void, an absolute absence of light, of shape, of anything. It was like the train had docked against the edge of the universe. For a long, stretched-out second, nothing happened. The doors just stood open, an impossible invitation. The silence returned, heavier now, charged with anticipation. And then they moved. It started with a single, soft thump. But it wasn't a single thump. It was a dozen shoes hitting the linoleum floor in the exact same microsecond. A sound so perfectly synchronized it felt like it had been produced by a machine. The man in the blazer took a step toward me. At the same instant, the woman with the paperback took a step. The kid with the headphones, the old woman, all of them. They moved like puppets controlled by a single, unseen hand. Their gaits were identical, a slow, shuffling, deliberate advance. There was no rush, no anger, no emotion at all. It was just a process starting. A piece of machinery beginning its cycle. My brain finally broke loose from the paralysis. Primal, animal terror took over. It was a feeling so pure and so powerful it burned away every other thought. No, I whimpered, the word barely a puff of air. Stay back. They didn't react. They didn't slow down. They didn't speed up. Thump, thump, thump. The sound of their shared footsteps was a slow, marching drumbeat, an executioner's rhythm. They closed the distance, their identical faces impassive, their eyes fixed on me. They weren't looking at me, not in a way that felt human. They were looking through me. I was a destination, a point on a map they were all walking toward. I scrambled backward, pressing myself harder against the doors behind me. My hands fumbled against the cold steel and glass, searching for a handle, a button, anything. There was nothing. These doors were sealed. My mind screamed. This was it. They were going to corner me, press in on me, and then what? I couldn't even begin to imagine what they wanted. And that was the worst part. The not knowing. My back was flat against the door now. Trapped. My eyes darted from side to side, a frantic, cornered animal looking for any gap in the fence. The figures were getting closer. 10 feet away. 8. I could see the weave of the fabric on the blazer. I could see the faint crease on the cover of the woman's book. It was in that moment of pure, undiluted panic that my eyes caught it. A flash of red against the dull gray wall, right next to the door I was pressed against. It was a handle, a heavy, metal lever, painted a faded, chipped red. And stenciled in white letters right above it were the words I'd seen a million times but never really registered: emergency door release. Pull handle down. Hope is a violent, desperate thing. It doesn't flutter in, it kicks the door down. A surge of adrenaline, so powerful it made my vision swim, erased everything else. The approaching figures, the fear, the impossible nature of it all. There was only the red handle. I didn't know what would happen. Would an alarm sound? Would it even work? And what was out there? The same black void that was on the other side? A concrete wall? The live third rail? It didn't matter. Any of those options was better than the one walking slowly toward me. The figure in the blazer was now only a few feet away. I could smell a faint, dusty scent, like old paper. Its arm began to lift, slowly, deliberately. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned, grabbed the cold metal lever with both hands, and threw my entire body weight into it. For a terrifying second, it didn't budge. It felt like it was rusted shut. I screamed, a raw, guttural sound of pure effort and terror, and yanked again, harder, putting every ounce of my will to live into that one motion. There was a thick, satisfying ka-chunk. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The door didn't slide open. It popped. The seal broke with a gasp of air, and the entire door panel jutted outward an inch, unlatched from the frame. It was open. It was my only chance. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I didn't look to see what was on the other side. My body was already in motion. I shoved the loose door, wedged my body through the narrow opening, and dove. I threw myself out of the train and into the absolute darkness of the tunnel. The world was a starburst of pain behind my eyes. I didn't hit a wall or another train. I hit the ground, hard. My shoulder took the brunt of the impact, and a shockwave of agony shot through my entire side. My head snapped back and connected with something hard and metallic. For a moment, all I knew was the blinding white flash of pain and the rough, sharp texture of gravel digging into my cheek and the palms of my hands. I lay there, gasping, the coppery taste of blood filling my mouth, the cold, damp smell of oil and concrete overwhelming my senses. The world was a spinning, agonizing mess. But I was out. I was out. For a second, there was nothing. No train, no faces, just a universe of white-hot pain exploding behind my eyes and the brutal, grinding reality of rocks digging into my skin. The air was knocked from my lungs in a wet, ragged gasp. I was on the ground, sprawled out in a way that felt all wrong, my body a marionette with its strings cut. The metallic tang of blood bloomed on my tongue, warm and thick. My cheek was pressed against the gravel, and the cold dampness of it was a shocking counterpoint to the fire in my shoulder and the back of my head. The smells hit me next. It was the smell of a basement, of a forgotten place. Damp concrete, a faint, chemical bitterness of oil, and the deep, earthy scent of cold stone. It was the smell of the city's underbelly. I was out. The thought was a weak little flag planted in a hurricane of agony and disorientation. But I was out. My senses started to trickle back in, one by one. I could hear a low hum, probably from the train I'd just thrown myself out of. I could hear the frantic, pathetic sound of my own breathing, each inhale a sharp, scraping effort. My body screamed at me not to move, but a deeper, more ancient part of my brain was already overriding it. You don't lie still when the wolves are near. Slowly, fighting a wave of nausea, I pushed up with my good arm. Gravel embedded itself in my palm, sharp and cruel. My whole world tilted violently. The train was still there, a long yellow caterpillar parked in the absolute black. The door I'd jumped from hung ajar, a dark, rectangular wound in its side. But it was the other door, the one directly across the car, that held my attention. It was still wide open, a perfect square of nothingness, an invitation to the void. And then I heard it. It wasn't a loud noise. It was a soft, almost casual sound. The scrape of a leather shoe on the linoleum floor of the train car, just inside the broken door. My blood ran cold. It was a colder, deeper fear than anything I'd felt a moment before. The fear of being trapped had been replaced by the fear of being pursued. I scrambled to my feet, a cry of pain catching in my throat as my injured shoulder protested. My knees were shredded, my nice work slacks torn and already sticky with blood. I didn't care. I couldn't care. I stumbled, caught my balance against the cold, curving wall of the tunnel, and looked. A figure was stepping out of the train. It was the man in the blazer. He didn't jump. He didn't rush. He placed one foot down on the gravel, then the other, with a slow, deliberate calmness that was infinitely more terrifying than any scream or charge. He straightened his jacket, and then he just stood there, his blank, identical face turned toward the darkness where I stood. He didn't seem to be looking for me. He seemed to know exactly where I was. Then another sound. The woman with the paperback stepped out, her movements a perfect mirror of the man's. Then the teenager, then the old woman. One by one, they disembarked from the train, not with the chaos of a panicked crowd, but with the synchronized, eerie precision of a drill team. They formed a loose line on the gravel ballast, their impassive faces all turned in my direction. They were waiting. My mind finally snapped. The switch flipped from survive the fall to run. I turned and ran. It wasn't a graceful run. It was a clumsy, hobbling, panicked flight. My office shoes, so practical for walking on pavement, were useless here. My ankles twisted on the uneven rocks. Every stride sent a jolt of fire through my shoulder and down my side. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. Behind me, the sound began. Thump, scrape, thump. It was the sound of footsteps on the gravel. Not a dozen different footsteps, clattering and stumbling. It was one sound, a single, rhythmic, synchronized step. Thump, a dozen feet landing at the exact same millisecond. Scrape, a dozen shoes dragging on the rocks in perfect unison. It was the sound of a machine. A human machine, marching after me. They weren't running. They weren't even walking fast. It was a steady, unhurried pace. A pace that said, we don't need to hurry. There's nowhere for you to go. We have all the time in the world. The darkness was a solid thing. It pressed in on me, thick and suffocating. The only light was from the emergency fixtures on the tunnel wall, spaced maybe 50 feet apart. They cast long, distorted shadows and gave off a sickly, weak yellow light that did little to pierce the gloom. Each one was a tiny island of safety in a vast ocean of black. I ran from one pool of light to the next, my lungs burning, a raw, coppery taste in my mouth. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, a perfect, concrete tube disappearing into infinity. Pipes and thick bundles of cables ran along the wall like metallic veins, slick with moisture. Thump, scrape, thump, scrape. The sound was always there. It never got closer, but it never faded, either. It was a constant, a metronome counting down the seconds I had left. I didn't dare look back. I knew what I would see. A line of identical faces, lit from below by the last emergency light, their eyes fixed on me, their legs moving in that same, horrifying rhythm. Looking back would be admitting defeat. Looking back would mean letting the fear win. And if the fear won, my legs would stop working. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. It was a loop of pure terror. Who are they? What do they want? How can they all look the same? There were no answers, only the cold, damp air and the relentless sound of the pursuit. I tried to focus on something, anything, other than the sound. I focused on the next light. Just get to the next light. That became my mantra. Just one more. Just get to the yellow light. I passed a signal box, its single red eye staring out into the darkness like a demon. I passed a small alcove carved into the wall, probably for workers to duck into, but I didn't dare stop. Stopping meant letting them catch up. Stopping meant the thumping would cease, and they would be there. My body was screaming. A sharp stitch had developed in my side, a hot knife twisting with every ragged breath. My vision was starting to swim at the edges, the yellow lights blurring into long streaks. I was losing steam. I knew it. How long could I keep this up? A minute? 5? The tunnel showed no signs of ending. No hint of a station platform, no glimmer of daylight. It was in one of these moments, as I gasped for air in the dim halo of another emergency lamp, that I saw it. Just ahead, maybe 2 lights down. A change in the texture of the tunnel wall. It wasn't just the smooth, curved concrete anymore. There was something else. A dark, vertical line. A ladder. Hope is a physical thing. It felt like a jolt of electricity, clearing my head and flooding my limbs with a fresh wave of adrenaline that burned away the pain. A ladder going up. Up meant out. I fixed my eyes on it and poured every last ounce of energy I had into my legs. I wasn't just running anymore, I was lunging, stumbling, falling forward toward that thin metal strip. The sound behind me didn't change. Thump, scrape, thump, scrape. They didn't speed up to catch me. They didn't need to. They were inevitable. I reached the ladder and practically threw myself at it. My hands, raw and bleeding, closed around a cold, rusty metal rung. It was real. It was solid. For a second, I just clung to it, my forehead pressed against the cold steel, sobbing for breath. I risked a glance down the tunnel. It was a mistake. They were there, just entering the edge of the light from the previous lamp. A silent, advancing phalanx. Their faces were all turned up towards me, blank and patient. They had stopped. They stood at the edge of the light, watching, waiting, as if they knew what was coming next. That sight broke the last of my hesitation. I started climbing. It was agony. My injured shoulder shrieked with every pull. The rungs were slick with dampness and grime. My shoes kept slipping, but I climbed. I climbed like a woman clawing her way out of a grave. I didn't look down again. I couldn't. I just focused on the next rung. Hand over hand, foot over foot. The sounds from below ceased. There was only the sound of my own grunting efforts, the scrape of my shoes against the concrete, and the frantic drumming of my heart. The climb felt like miles. The darkness above was just as absolute as the darkness below. For one heart-stopping moment, I thought the ladder just went up to a dead end in the ceiling. But then my hand hit something flat and solid. A ceiling, or a floor. I reached up farther, patting frantically in the dark. My fingers brushed against a heavy, gridded metal surface. A manhole cover. I pushed. Nothing. It didn't budge. It felt like it was sealed with lead. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through me. Trapped. I was trapped again, dangling on a ladder in the dark while those things waited below. No, I whimpered, the sound swallowed by the vastness of the tunnel. I tried again, positioning my good shoulder underneath it and shoving with all my might. I screamed, a raw, frustrated sound of pure exertion. The cover lifted just a fraction of an inch, before slamming back down with a deafening clang that echoed through the tunnel. But it had moved. A surge of desperate strength coursed through me. I wasn't going to die here. I positioned myself again, took a half breath, and heaved. My entire body shook with the effort. Muscles I didn't know I had screamed in protest. The cover lifted. An inch. 2 inches. Light and sound trickled in from the edges. The sound of rain. The hiss of tires on a wet street. The sound of the world. With a final, guttural roar, I shoved it sideways. It slid off its seating with a grating shriek of metal on concrete, and a cascade of dirty water and night air washed over me. I didn't wait. I hooked my arms over the edge of the opening and pulled myself up and out, collapsing onto the blessedly solid, wonderfully wet pavement of the street. I was out. I was really out. I lay on the asphalt, the cold rain plastering my hair to my face, washing the grime and blood from my skin. The city lights were dizzyingly bright, the air sharp and clean in my burning lungs. I was in an alleyway somewhere. I could see the glow of a main street at the end of it. It was the most beautiful sight I had ever seen. Forcing myself to my knees, then to my feet, I stumbled out of the alley and onto a busy street. People with umbrellas hurried past, giving me wide berth, their faces a blur of mild alarm and indifference. A car horn blared. To them, I was just some crazy, disheveled woman who'd had a bad night. They had no idea. A yellow cab was idling at the traffic light. Without thinking, I lurched into the street and yanked the back door open, falling inside onto the vinyl seat. The driver, a middle-aged man with a weary face, jumped and turned around, his eyes wide. "Hey, what the hell? Go," I gasped, my voice a raw croak. I slammed the door shut. "Please, just go." I rattled off my address, the syllables tumbling over each other. He stared at me for another second, taking in my torn clothes, my bleeding hands, the wild look in my eyes. He must have seen something in them, something more than just drunk or crazy. He must have seen the pure, primal terror. He looked forward, muttered something I couldn't hear, and when the light turned green, he hit the gas. The taxi lurched forward, pulling away from the curb and merging into the flow of traffic. Away from the alley, away from the manhole, I huddled in the back seat, shivering, dripping water and blood onto his floor. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I just stared straight ahead through the rain-streaked windshield as the lights of the city washed over me, carrying me away from the impossible darkness that lived just beneath our feet. I don't know how long I sat in the back of that cab. Time had sort of melted. The driver didn't say another word, just drove, his eyes occasionally flicking to me in the rearview mirror. I probably looked like a ghost. I felt like one. The vinyl seat was cold and slick against my wet clothes. Every jolt of the car sent a fresh, sickening wave of pain through my shoulder. My hands were on my lap, palms up. They were a mess of raw skin and drying blood, the gravel still embedded in some of the cuts like tiny, dark jewels. I just stared at them. They didn't feel like my hands. He pulled up to my apartment building. For a second, I didn't recognize it. It looked too normal, too solid. Just a brick building on a city street, same as a million others. The driver cleared his throat. "This is it, lady." I fumbled for my purse. My fingers were clumsy, numb. I managed to pull out a wad of cash and just pushed it over the seat. I didn't count it. "Keep it," I croaked. I didn't wait for a reply. I stumbled out of the cab and onto the curb, slamming the door behind me. The taxi sped off, leaving me alone in the rain. Getting the keys into the main door lock was a 10-year ordeal. My hands were shaking so violently that the key just kept scraping against the metal plate. A raw, sob-like sound escaped my throat. It was a sound of pure frustration. Finally, it clicked. I practically fell inside the lobby, then repeated the whole nightmarish process with my apartment door on the 3rd floor. The second the door was open, I slammed it shut behind me and threw the deadbolt. The heavy thunk of the bolt sliding home was the first safe sound I'd heard all night. I stood there in my little entryway, dripping onto the welcome mat, just listening to the sound of my own breathing. It was ragged and wet. My apartment was dark, silent, but it wasn't a comforting silence. It was a listening silence. I felt like if I stood here long enough, I'd hear the thump, scrape, start up again, right outside my door. I had to move. I had to do something normal. The shower was first. I turned it on as hot as I could stand and just stood under the spray in my torn, filthy work clothes. The water hitting the cuts on my hands and knees was a sharp, clean kind of pain. It was real. It hurt, and because it hurt, it felt true. I watched the water swirl around my feet, turning a murky brown, then a faint pink as it washed the blood and grime away. I peeled off the ruined clothes, my blazer, my slacks, my blouse, and let them fall into a sodden pile on the shower floor. I was going to throw them all away. I never wanted to see them again. I scrubbed my skin until it was raw, trying to wash off more than just the dirt from the tunnel. I was trying to wash off the memory of those faces, the blankness, the way they all moved together, the feeling of their eyes on me, but it was no use. It was tattooed on the inside of my eyelids. After, I wrapped myself in the biggest towel I owned and limped into the living room. I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat on the edge of my couch in the dark, staring at the window. The rain was still coming down, tracing patterns on the glass. The city lights glowed through it, a fuzzy, impressionistic blur of orange and white. The world out there was still going on. People were sleeping in their beds. People were driving home from bars. They had no idea. They had no idea what was living under their feet. I didn't sleep. I don't think I could have even if I wanted to. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. Stepping off the train, their feet hitting the gravel in perfect unison. So I just sat there, shivering, until the black sky outside started to fade into a bruised, gray dawn. Morning, a new day. The thought felt like a sick joke. The silence was getting to me. It felt too much like the silence in the tunnel between their steps. I needed noise. I needed proof that the world was still the same place it had been yesterday. I reached for the TV remote on the coffee table. My hand was still shaking. I clicked it on. The screen flickered to life, bathing the dim room in a cool blue light. It was the local morning news. 2 chipper anchors, a man and a woman, were sitting behind a desk, smiling. They were talking about a charity 5K run that happened over the weekend. Then a weather report, rain clearing up by the afternoon. It was all so painfully, wonderfully normal. I felt a knot in my chest loosen just a little. I let the sound wash over me, the meaningless chatter a balm on my frayed nerves. I was just a woman in her apartment, watching the news. I was safe. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe the stress, the exhaustion. Maybe I had some kind of waking nightmare. A hallucination. It was possible, wasn't it? The mind can do strange things when it's pushed too far. I clung to that thought like a life raft. A breakdown, a psychotic episode. It was a terrifying explanation, but it was 1,000 times better than the alternative. And in other local news, the Mail anchor said, his expression turning a little more serious. There were significant delays on the city's Red Line last night after a communications and power failure led to a train temporarily going off-grid. Officials are calling it a minor but complex system glitch. My blood went cold. I sat up straight, my entire body rigid. I couldn't breathe. The screen cut to a female reporter standing on a subway platform. It was my station, my stop, the one the train had blown right through. She was a little damp from the rain, holding a microphone. "That's right, Tom," she said, her voice crisp and professional. Nervous moments for transit authorities last night when a southbound train, the last one of the evening, ceased all communication and disappeared from the system map for nearly 2 hours. But the good news this morning is that the train was eventually located, stalled in a tunnel between the 23rd and 34th Street stations. All passengers were found safe and unharmed. Safe, unharmed. My mind snagged on the words. A wave of dizzying relief washed over me. It was just a glitch. A power failure. That explained why it stopped in the tunnel. It explained everything. The faces. I was just tired. I was panicking in the dark. My mind filled in the blanks and played a terrible trick on me. That's all it was. Oh, God, that's all it was. I let out a shaky breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "We're here with some of the passengers who were on that train," the reporter continued, turning. "They've just been medically cleared and are, understandably, very relieved." The camera panned over to a small group of people standing nearby. There were maybe 5 or 6 of them. They looked a little tired, a little rumpled, but otherwise fine. One of them, a man in a familiar-looking dark blazer, stepped forward to speak. And the world stopped. It was him. It was the first face I'd seen. The one I thought was just a trick of the light. The normal, forgettable face that had started it all. He was standing there, looking directly at the reporter, his expression one of weary relief. "It was very strange," he was saying to the reporter. His voice was calm, unremarkable. "The lights just flickered, and then we just stopped. In the middle of nowhere. It was pitch black for a while. A bit scary, but we all kept calm. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I couldn't tear my eyes away." The camera held on him, and then panned slightly to include the woman standing next to him. The woman who had been reading the paperback. She had the same face. The exact same. The same smooth cheeks, the same placid mouth, the same empty distance in the eyes. She nodded in agreement with what the man was saying, a small, polite gesture. Beside her was the teenager, his headphones now dangling around his neck. And the old woman, and a few others I'd only glimpsed. All of them, all standing there, all with the same face. They were talking to the reporter, their voices overlapping slightly, a chorus of calm explanation. The transit workers were very professional when they arrived. "We're just glad it's over. A little shaken up, but we're okay. I was going to be sick." The room started to spin. This wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was real. They were real. They were standing on a brightly lit platform, passing as human, and no one else could see it. No one else noticed. The reporter was smiling at them, nodding sympathetically. The cameraman was holding a steady shot. To them, they were just a group of random, shaken-up commuters. But I could see. My sanity, the little thread I had been clinging to, finally snapped. This was a nightmare I wasn't waking up from. They weren't monsters hiding in the dark. They were hiding in plain sight. The interview was wrapping up. The reporter was thanking them for their time. "Well, a scary ordeal, but a happy ending for everyone involved," she chirped, turning back to the camera. As she did, the camera began to pull back, widening the shot. For just a second, it lingered on the group, on the man in the blazer. He had stopped talking. His role in the little performance was over. He wasn't looking at the reporter anymore. He was looking directly into the camera lens. He was looking at me. I knew it. It wasn't a generalized stare into the camera. It was a look of specific, direct recognition. His eyes, so blank and empty moments before, now held something. A flicker of intelligence, of awareness. He knew I was out there. He knew I had run. And then he did something that shattered the last bit of my world into a million tiny pieces. As the broadcast began to cut away, in the final fraction of a second before the screen switched back to the studio anchors, the corner of his mouth twitched. It was almost nothing, a tiny, upward pull of the muscle, so slight that anyone else would have missed it completely. It was a smile, and it was for me. The remote fell from my hand and clattered onto the hardwood floor. I didn't even flinch. I just sat there on my couch, in the cold blue light of the television, as the two anchors began to talk about the traffic on the interstate. The sounds of their voices were just noise, static from a world I didn't belong to anymore. I was no longer just a survivor of a random, monstrous attack. I was a witness. I was the one that got away. And they knew I was watching. They weren't just creatures in a tunnel. They were out here, they were part of the world, and they were waiting.